there, welcome to That's Not Proper, and I'm your host, Corey Ascension. My guest today is Susan Sloan. She is an author and speaker. She works for a global advocacy organization, has met with more than 60 countries through diplomacy, engaging with diplomats, international leaders, and government officials, and has written a book called A Seat at the Table: Women, Diplomacy, and Lessons for the World. Thank you for chatting with me today, Susan. How are you doing?
Thanks for having me. I'm good. Sitting here in Washington, D.C. amidst the coronavirus. We're all in lockdown. I think we feel it all around the country, no matter where we are. Yeah. But we're still sheltering in place and in our homes, and I don't know when it's going to let up. But meanwhile, my book is published and still trucking. So
Let's talk about the book a little bit. I want to talk about several things, and obviously, but the big thing I want to talk about is this book. Tell me a little bit, like a brief synopsis. What is this book about?
Well, it's all in the title, Women, Diplomacy, and Lessons for the World. The book contains stories and research and data. And the stories come from about 30 ambassadors, foreign ministers, and government officials, all women, and how they rose in the ranks of leadership. And that's what the book is about. It has these stories of how they have had survived and thrived in these positions of power, how they got there, the obstacles they had to overcome, and then what they've done with their power, how they convene and build consensus for different people and create better solutions for the world.
I noticed when I read a little bit of the book, there was two phrases, I guess you would say phrases, terms that are used. And it was gender equality and gender parity. What is the difference between those two, or the
Well,
similarities?
sure, they are different. When you think about gender equality, you probably think about being equal between men and women
Hmm.
and having equal rights, maybe representation, maybe if you look at voting, of equality. Now, gender parity, if that's more so looking at the example I use is who's around the table, that it's not just 50-50, but the voices are actually heard and used. And if you look up the words, if the phrases gender equality and gender parity on Google, you'll see that they sound very, very similar.
Hmm.
But it's really more about numbers, and the gender parity is a little bit different than equality.
Okay. So it's the idea of, correct me if I'm wrong, 100 people in the room, it's 50-50 as far as men and women are concerned. 50 men, 50 women at the table in that room. Okay.
Right. It's also the socioeconomic index. Gender parity also has to deal with that. And it's also about the education of men and women.
Mm,
So we're looking at gender parity, so education, socioeconomics, and it's basically a calculation.
okay.
It has more to do with statistical data as well.
So what caused you to write this book? What was the crescendo, the moment that you said, something needs to be done. I need to write this book.
Well, I've always wanted to write a book, and I
Mm,
didn't know exactly what it was going to be about. But last spring, actually, so spring 2019, I was sitting at a gala for another organization, and they happened to honor all women leaders. So a few ambassadors, a general, other prominent women. And it was the first event I went to that honored all women. And the stories that I heard at that event brought tears to my eyes. And I write about this in the prologue of the book. And I thought to myself, I'm sitting there, everyone's in tuxedos, I'm in a formal outfit as well. And I thought, who is telling and sharing these stories? Are these just happening in a vacuum that no one's ever going to hear about them except at this event? And it spurred me to think about how we relate these stories of women leaders and share them with the world. And so that was the impetus of the book.
what is your definition of diplomacy?
Well, I think it depends who you ask.
Right. That's why I asked for your
Yeah,
definition.
I think when I think about diplomacy, and this is a informal definition, uh, I think about countries and people working together to create solutions and coalitions without the use of war or warfare tactics. So really using
Mm.
conversations as tools rather than warfare.
Those are very behind the scene things that myself, as just a regular old citizen, we don't really see these things occur. You hear the terms, so and so is an ambassador to another country, but we don't really have any idea. I mean, at least I know I don't have really any idea what that actually means. So, what does it mean when someone is an ambassador for another country? Let's say, take for an example, one of the people that you discussed was Mary Beth Long.
Mm. So Mary Beth Long, her role was a little bit different. She was Assistant Secretary of Defense.
Okay, that's right.
And then her previous role, she originally started her job in the CIA under the State Department. So if we go back to your first question about diplomacy, diplomacy is this international relations where men and women work on behalf of their country and represent their country in other countries.
Hmm.
So when you think about we'll use the U.S. State Department. When we have an ambassador representing the United States in another country, they're running an entire embassy, and they're the first one in charge. They're like the CEO essentially,
Okay.
and
Hmm.
then the second person down is the deputy chief of mission, which is like a vice president
Okay.
or someone else in the C-suite. So if you think president and vice president, you have the ambassador and deputy chief of mission, and then you have all the other diplomats and staff. Now that embassy works in that country on behalf of the United States.
Hmm.
So when you think about other countries that are not the United States and they have their diplomats in Washington, D.C., or in consulates around the country, they are working on behalf of their country. So, for instance, when I interviewed ambassadors from Sweden and Namibia and Finland and Denmark and Mexico, they're all from their respective countries living in Washington, D.C., in the United
Mm.
States, representing their own country's interests. And so they focus on diplomatic relations between the United States and their own country.
Okay.
And that's a little bit of a distinction.
The position that I'm in as a mom and just, I don't know, a regular old person, I just see what happens in the news, so you don't always understand these intricate parts that are going on when you're talking about conversations that are occurring between countries. And in addition to that, when you're thinking about when they are having to navigate conversations to avoid any type of huge blowout. I mean, I'm sure there's
Mhm.
better words than that they use, but a lot of these people are not women that are doing these things. That it's been primarily dominated by men. Now, I was pretty excited to see there was a couple countries, obviously a little disappointing it's not the US, but there's a few countries that are really stepping up as far as, bridging that gap in the sense of gender equality and gender parity when it comes to diplomatic relations.
Right.
And I think I want to say, was it Sweden or was it Finland? I'm trying to remember right now
Well,
that you had.
Sweden, in their most recent research and data, that they have more women ambassadors than other countries right now. But that can always change, right? So next year that
Right.
could be different. The stats always change, but Sweden and Finland are definitely on the forefront of having the most women ambassadors abroad. And looking at foreign ministries, the numbers are changing in how women, the percentages of women being diplomats in these roles. And if you go back, and I talk about this in the beginning of the book, in the 1970s, that's when women really started entering the foreign service at higher rates than previous years. There were many rules against women in the foreign service. For instance, if you got married, you had to leave the foreign service.
Mm.
If there was another
Is
rule that
that still
that's
pertains
not
to
a rule
now?
anymore. Yeah, that's not
Okay.
a rule. Thank goodness.
Hmm.
Another rule was, now think about this: if you were a women diplomat, and let's say you're in your 20s or 30s, and you were posted abroad, let's say in Spain, and you work for the U.S., uh, most likely you're going to meet other diplomats. And so
Hmm.
there was a rule in the 1970s that you couldn't marry another foreign service officer.
Hmm.
So it really diminished the opportunity for women to even get married and be in their profession. So many women left the foreign service. Now, when that rule changed, it really opened up the foreign service. And another rule that existed in until the 1970s was a rule that women couldn't have hard language training. So trainings in Chinese and Mandarin and Russian and Arabic. And if you didn't have those languages, you weren't posted in the really interesting and hard posts. So once that language rule was changed, and Ambassador Barbara Bodine speaks about this because she was one of the first women to get hard language training. Once that rule changed, that women could learn different languages, then we saw way more women joining the foreign service and being diplomats for the United States. And that's different, in other countries. Obviously, they have their own rules, but having those rules changed women in for the foreign service.
And so that rule applied just to women?
Correct.
Oh my goodness. It's mind-boggling to think that they thought that that was a thing. Like, I mean, I don't understand what would be the reason to restrict women but not men in that aspect. I can't even come up with a rational, oh,
Right.
well, it makes
The men
zero
got
sense.
the language training. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, and other than it kept women out of positions of a higher rank or power is the only thing that I could think of. Now, what have they noticed, or what did you notice, especially through your research and in writing the book? What are the main differences between men and women in these types of positions?
But what I learned from these women and interviewing them and their stories is that women have inherent traits such as coalition and consensus builders. And this will resonate with you and other mothers out there, that typically in families, you are the coalition builders. When there's different arguments within a family, mom's usually the one who's going to solve it and put
Hmm.
everyone in their corner. And think about that on a larger scale in diplomacy when you have countries not agreeing or security issues internationally, that women have the innate ability to bring people together, hear other people's opinions rather than just their own, so less hierarchical. And the leadership traits of women are typically different. And that's what we're seeing now in diplomacy, that women who are leading embassies as ambassadors, or even different levels of diplomats and different levels of management, that they bring different traits than men. And what I heard in numerous interviews was that typically women have less ego than men.
Mm.
Now, that's not to say all men don't, you know, that's not to say that all men have ego. I don't want to put all men under the bus. This is not against the patriarchy or anything.
Right.
This is more so uh, that women take their ego away if they have it and want a solution for the team. And the way women see team dynamics is far different typically than men.
Now, had they done studies and things like that to be able to find this to be factual and then share those studies within these areas to prove that, hey, we need to change things up a bit?
Well, what we're seeing now, if we look at the private sector, so not dealing with diplomacy, but in the private sector, if there are boards that have more equal representation of women, the profits of organizations are larger than boards who do not have women represented on that board.
Mm.
When you're looking at a workforce, the diversity factor around an organization bringing different ideas usually brings more profit and revenue for an organization. So if we look at those data points, then yes,
Mhm.
there is data to support that. And it's not to say all women leaders don't have ego, and there are women leaders who aren't that great.
Mhm.
It's not to put a whole blanket on all women that all women are great, but what it is showing is that when you have this diversity of gender making decisions and coming up with different ideas because men and women see things differently, it produces better results. And there's a few statistics I use in the book that peace agreements are more likely to last a far more percentage than without women. And there's different data points that I use. However, I really find that stories are the things that people remember more than any kind of data I throw
The
out.
data. Yeah, I
Yeah,
think I remember reading that, and you and I talked about this, I think, before, but that women in civil society groups, it was 64% less likely to fail when it was a woman who was in those agreements.
correct.
And that was amazing to me. But you're right, reading some of those stories really alters your mindset. What really struck me at first too was, being a woman and hearing their struggles. It was hard to not get mad, as you're reading and hearing just the accusations that were placed. Oh my gosh. I just can't imagine. They have to have a thick skin, because going into this, you're already dinged just because of what your gender is.
Right.
And then you have these assumptions. It's like I can hear it on the news already. Oh, let's check into her maybe sexual activity and previous relationships, and who did she sleep with to get to the top. Really, she couldn't possibly have the mindset of a man. And so when I was reading some of their stories, it was a little bit difficult to not get a little bit frustrated, because I think that's unfortunately that's the story for the lifestyle and living for a lot of women just in general. And so then to see that they went through all of these things and stuck it out, because that's what blew my mind, because I don't know if I could stick something like that out. It would, it's got to tear you down pretty significantly.
And Mary Beth Long's story, she's such a fascinating woman. She started her career in the CIA
Mm,
as a CIA operative, and she was working under the disguise of being a diplomat at the State Department in
yeah.
Latin America. And she got a few great mentors early on in her career. And I write about some of the anecdotes of what her mentors shared with her, and how she really embraced her own voice. And as she grew in the ranks of leadership, so she was appointed and selected to be the first woman to be Assistant Secretary of Defense. So that's a very, very big role
Mhm.
at the Pentagon. And if you think about the equivalent of it, that role is the equivalent of a 4-star military general for a civilian.
Wow.
It's one of the highest ranking roles, and she was the first woman to serve as that. And so during her confirmation, she got these accusations,
Hmm.
and many accusations, and they had to launch a formal investigation. So it was, some of the accusations included that she traded uh, military military circumstances for sex,
Mm,
that she wasn't married, so who was she dating? She had breast cancer. Was it going to come back? Would that be an issue? All these different things. And while she was being investigated, she still had to continue working. And there were people who were trying to take her down. And she'd walk into work every day knowing that people wanted to take her down.
mm.
Eventually, she got confirmed and she served in that role. And she got many different distinctions of honors after she finished her role. But her story is one of many that many women, to really break that glass ceiling, they go through hurdles that men don't. And what she said to me when I interviewed her was that she was okay with being confirmed and being asked hard questions, just as any man would be confirmed.
Mhm.
It was the allegations that men didn't have to deal with that really got under her skin.
Right.
And that's the double standard that we're looking at, is that for women to be in these leadership positions, that they should not have to go through hurdles that men aren't having to go through.
Right. When you were writing this book, so going into writing it and then, during and then after, what do you think mindset wise changed the most? Or what was like the most shocking that you learned that maybe you didn't know before?
There were multiple things that were shocking. To tell you the truth, that I didn't know before. Their stories became my treasure trove
Hmm.
of almost like mentors and guides. And before I wrote this book, I understood how important these voices were to hear from women. However, I didn't necessarily embrace my own voice
Mm.
as a woman as much as I could have before. And now that I know these stories, it's given me more confidence after reading this book. And I hope that many women feel that way. And also with these stories, what I found is that men reading them, they didn't know all these women went through these different issues and circumstances. And different men of power are now reading this book thinking, wow, we really need to change something too.
Mm.
So that has changed, but I've started to embrace my own unique voice, and also give myself some grace. I remember when I was sitting down, the Finnish ambassador, and she shared with me that she still has self doubt. And here she is at the highest rank of her career,
Mhm.
being an ambassador to the United States, one of the most prominent posts in the world. And she shares with me that she still has self doubt. And that makes everyone human, essentially.
Right.
And that no matter how high you get, you always can have some self doubt. And what I learned from this process is that we all have fear.
Mhm.
And the opposite of fear is not fearlessness, it's courage.
Mm.
And if you're not fearful, then maybe there's something wrong. Maybe there's a little bit too much ego. You should be a little bit fearful when you're doing something new for the first time and it's scary. But the opposite, and what you deal with it is really evoking courage.
Mhm.
And that's what I've learned through this process is having more courage and being okay with that fear. I think we all have it, and even ambassadors have it, or presidents, or all different people have it, but using courage rather than saying that you shouldn't have fear because you're going to have it anyways.
As a parent or a friend or whatever, I'll say, well, don't be afraid. Don't be afraid. You know, you say that. I think we say it because we don't know what else to say. But, you say that a lot. Don't be afraid. I think that what it has to do with when I'm saying things like that, or when I'm talking to people that are fearful, what I'm trying to convey is more that don't let the fear take over. Because when the fear controls you, then I don't even know if you can get the courage that is needed then to press on to whatever it is that's causing that fear. You mentioned men reading the book, and so I'm curious then, what's the feedback been, and the encouragement that it's necessary? I think lots of times when we think about women, needing to be heard and our voice needing to be shared, we cannot forget that it is necessary to have men come alongside and say the same thing, especially when you're talking about them being in positions of such power. If they're not working alongside us, we're going to have an even bigger fight.
Right? We need men allies, especially now more than ever. And both men and women need to see both genders as mentors and guides. So men need to see women as mentors, women need to see men as mentors, both up and down the ladder, to really reach that gender equality and gender parity. And that some of the feedback I've gotten so far from different men who have read the book, one, and if you want to edit this language out, you
No,
can.
just go
They
ahead.
usually they usually say, "Oh, that ambassador is a badass. I didn't even know
Yeah.
about that. Man, Barbara Bodine and Occupy Kuwait. Wow, think about her." So there's so many men seeing these women as these trailblazers
Hmm.
and hearing their stories, and they didn't know about. They're like, "Wow, I didn't know these women did that." And it's inspiring. And it also draws attention to both men and women when we're around the table and these decision making tables, and it can be anywhere. You can think about your team and your coworkers sitting around a table. You can think about if you're on a planning committee at the PTA who's sitting around the table, what kind of faces are around the table? And that's what men and women are seeing, I think, from reading this book, of really looking at how we look at gender and diversity.
Hmm.
So, what faith groups are recognized around the table? What genders? What socioeconomic status, maybe? What ethnicity?
Hmm.
And do we have diversity around the table, really sharing ideas and helping create better solutions? Because with diversity, there's a far more creative way of thinking. And so the men who read this book have told me, wow, I didn't realize that I never noticed who was sitting around the table.
Mm-hmm.
And they've started to say to me, Susan, when I go back to work, because everyone's home right now,
Right.
I want to think about how we bring more women to the table. And more than that, I want to see how we elevate women's voices and stories, especially in our workplace. So it's very heartwarming to hear that. And I hope that men continue to read this book too.
My hope would be that we could actually stop looking at gender necessarily, so that we're just, obviously you want different genders and you want everybody's voice in there. And if there's just one white man there, you're not getting everybody's voice in there. But the idea that these women can come on board, and instead of being looked at as a female ambassador or someone who's a female in this role, but looking at her as someone who is an ambassador instead of just a female. I mean, does that make sense? Do you see what I'm saying?
You are right on the money. You are 100% correct. So right now, with the ambassadors I spoke with from Nordic and Scandinavian countries, so for instance, Sweden and Finland and Denmark, they think of themselves just as the ambassador.
Mm.
They do not think of themselves as women ambassadors, anything like that. I am just the ambassador and I am a diplomat.
Mm.
Now, if you ask people from other countries who are maybe regionally a little bit different, it's definitely regionally different. There's one diplomat I interviewed who her country is not named in the book, but she's referred to as the diplomat.
Mm-hmm.
And she comes from a Muslim majority country. And she wasn't even comfortable having her country named in the book.
Mm.
That says something.
Right.
And so she thinks of herself as a woman diplomat. And she hopes that one day she is not considered the woman diplomat from this Muslim majority country, but just as a diplomat.
Right.
And her country and her region where she's from is not there yet. And they're working on it, but they're not there yet. And so when we look at women in different positions, it shouldn't be that this person is the token woman. It should be, yes, the person's there on merit and qualified, and they just happen to be the person in the position.
Right.
Right. So that is the goal. The end game is to not really see a difference between gender, is that you have a mix of genders and they're in different positions.
Mm-hmm.
And they represent themselves and their countries, and that's it. But right now, many of the women that I interviewed were the first women ambassadors posted to Washington, D.C., serving their country, or they were the first woman foreign minister, the first woman X, Y, or Z person,
Mm-hmm.
and we know them as that. However, the more first we knock off our list, then it won't be an issue. That it'll just be, oh yeah, and this person is this position. They just happen to be a woman.
Right. I wonder, I don't know if you got any of this type of information while writing the book, but how many of these women that you did speak with, or even just in research, felt like they were, as a child or high school, junior high, whichever, that their education was encouraging them towards a position like this?
Now I'm thinking of the list of women in my head that I interviewed. None of them really knew they were going to be diplomats, to tell you the truth. They all valued education, and some of their families valued it extensively. They thought, oh, you need to go to college to do X, Y, or Z. And some of them, they just happened to be curious about the world. What I found with all the women I interviewed who are diplomats, and there's a few in the book that aren't diplomats. They're, government officials in different capacities. But the women who are all diplomats, they had a curiosity about international relations, security, politics, and governments. Mm-hmm. And that's really where their interests lied. And that created their career path. And if I'll tell you one story about the deputy chief of mission from Croatia. Her grandfather was the last rabbi of Yugoslavia. Now, she wasn't raised Jewish. She really didn't know much about her Jewish background. And she, after high school, went to Israel to learn Hebrew and go to an Israeli university just to figure out her background of her heritage. And when she came back to Croatia, she couldn't find a job. She was applying to different sectors and wasn't getting a lot of bites. Mm-hmm. And her dad saw an ad in the Croatian newspaper for a position with the new Croatian embassy that was about to be opened in Israel, and they needed people who spoke Croatian and Hebrew. And so she applied and she got it. And she went over to Israel to help start this new embassy, applied to be a diplomat, and started her career in diplomacy. And now has been all over the world, served in Afghanistan with the UN, with the elections, and she's done all this amazing work. And it came from an ad in a newspaper
Wow.
that her dad showed her.
Wow.
So you never know in life
Yeah.
what you're going to do, but you can't say no to yourself, right?
Right.
And that's what I learned from these women. You have to say yes to yourself. Like, why not? I'm going to throw my hat in the ring. I may get it, I may not, but I'm going to at least try it out.
I ask because I just think a lot of times we don't, at least my generation, we weren't raised to be thinking in the mindset of high government official type things. It was more like mom, nurse, maybe a chef. It wasn't, these higher ranking big deal things when you're talking about global relations and things like that. And so I'm curious if there's a way to then change the narrative on the conversation that we have with our kids, and a book like this for them to read this, because like I said, reading the first few stories that I read, I think it would really alter my mindset if I was young and in school. I'm too old now, but if I was young and in school, because
Right.
I don't know if young girls recognize that they have within them the ability to do these amazing, wonderful, great things, and how empowering that would be for them. It's like maybe we should make it required reading.
Hey, I would love that. I
Yeah.
think every school should make this book require
Yeah,
reading.
I think it would be great. I really
I
do.
agree with you, though. I grew up in Georgia,
Mhm.
in the south part of America. And as a Southerner, I was raised to get an education. I went to University of Georgia for my undergraduate degree. And it was a known thing between friends and family that you grow up, you get a degree, you get a good job, and you find someone and you get married.
Mhm.
And you have kids and you have a house, and that's your life. And there's nothing wrong with that,
Right.
right? Those are all choices that people can make, and they're all beautiful, lovely choices.
Mhm.
However, when I got a job in Washington, D.C., my first job out of the state of Georgia, it opened up this whole world. And what I realized is that moving away from where I was from allowed me to see the world in a different lens and a different perspective. And moving to DC, I saw all these women working in these different capacities on Capitol Hill and embassies and think tanks and these major companies and as women leaders. And I thought, oh, wow, there's women who aren't married and they have this career. And there's women who are married who have a career. There's women who are divorced and have a career. And it opened my eyes that there's many ways to live life as a woman. And there's not a cookie cutter way that makes it, no, you have to do this.
Mhm.
And hearing from these women leaders, especially the women, some women I interviewed have families and children, and some didn't, and some are divorced, and some are still looking to find a spouse. There's no right or wrong way, but you have options. And that's the thing I would tell young girls now is you have options. And if you're interested in international affairs or international relations, and you're curious about the world, then check out diplomacy.
Mhm.
Check out what it means to be a diplomat, and see what you can do. But also, many people like having a government job because it has a great pension and has great benefits.
Right.
So,
Yeah, I'm always
you
telling
know,
my kids, because my kids are in their 20s. I've got one that's already graduated from college, but I have one that's in college right now. I'm like, government jobs are great because you're pretty much set for life there. I don't know if he'll
yeah.
end up doing that, but I'm telling them that all the time. It's a benefits alone, they can get you there. When you wrote this and when you were done, can you tell us who your absolute favorite was?
Whew. Oh my gosh, they're all like these characters in this book to me that I adore. I don't think I can choose a favorite, to tell you the truth, because each of the women had such fascinating stories
Mhm.
on their own.
Were you nervous talking to them?
You know what? At first, I was.
Yeah.
Because I thought, who am I to sit down with these ambassadors who
Right.
represent their country, and they're letting me come to their embassies, their offices, and you know. But as I started going through the process, it got easier.
Mm.
And I started trusting myself more, that I had 5 questions that I asked. I kept the conversation between 30 minutes to an hour and sometimes 2 hours, depending upon the diplomat and how much they wanted to share. But what I realized that when you're interviewing people, and you probably know this too, running the podcast, is that it's the ability to get people to open up and share their story.
Hmm.
And once people trust you and feel comfortable with you, they will share things that you would never imagine they would share with you. So there's even things that are not in the book that these women share with me that I'm not allowed to share
Hmm.
uh, publicly, but what their thoughts on different world leaders, their own insecurities about issues, and really sitting down with them and hearing their story and then giving their story life. And when I went through the process of writing the book, I had to get every single government and foreign ministry to sign off on their stories that were going to
Oh,
be
wow.
published. Now, that process alone is sometimes tedious, but I will tell you it's very worthwhile because I wanted all these women to feel comfortable with how their stories are portrayed publicly. And that was really important to me, that they felt respected and heard, and that it represented who they are.
Do you feel like they were eager to tell their stories? I'm just
Yeah.
thinking, they've had these experiences. And even as you're saying, you've got men reading this book, people reading it, but especially men, and going, I didn't know this, and here they are now able to share. Some of that was, I'd use the word intimate because when you're talking about your character being attacked and, lifestyles and things like that, that's intimate to me. And so they're sharing now in a public way what happened to them for the whole world, if they so choose to see. And so I'm curious as to how eager they were. There's a part of me that would wonder, oh yeah, everybody needs theirs, or did it take a moment?
Right. Well, I will say that there were a few women that I interviewed that, multiple women that first said to me, no one's ever asked me that.
Mm.
Um, in multiple interviews, I would say in the majority of interviews, the many women said to me, I've never actually shared this publicly. And I want to see what you write before you publish it.
Oh, how funny.
um, but I will say that there were different women that I interviewed that were apprehensive
Mm.
to share their stories at first with me, because they didn't want their country portrayed in a certain way, or they didn't want their own character be portrayed in a certain way.
Mm.
So I paid special attention, especially to those stories, to make sure it was very accurate and that it represented who they are and their country. Uh, because what I found that these women said to me is that if they don't speak, then their country won't be represented.
Right.
So even around the diplomacy table, if they don't speak at different meetings with our governments and leaders, then their countries don't speak.
Mm.
And what I found when I asked them to be interviewed for this book is that they thought, oh, wow, it's a great opportunity for our country to be highlighted and my story to be highlighted. And it's good PR.
Right.
But there are some countries that I reached out to, and a few ambassadors that I won't name, that declined.
Mm.
And they declined because they did not want to be seen as the token woman representing their country, and that they've already reached this equality, that they're just a diplomat, they're just an ambassador, and it doesn't matter that they're a woman.
Mm.
And it was actually in conversations with other ambassadors that they asked, "Hey, are you interviewing X, Y, or Z country?" And I said, "Oh, I reached out to them. They declined to be interviewed." And they thought, "Oh, that makes sense. That ambassador, they don't think of themselves as a woman ambassador. They just think of themselves as an ambassador." But some of the women that surprised me, very much so, were women who necessarily don't think of themselves as women ambassadors, but they thought, you know what, I'm going to share my story because if one or two people can benefit from it and grow, then it will be worthwhile. And so take my story and let's see what you do with it.
There was, I think it was something you said in the book, or maybe it was something you told me, that they don't, they say to stop saying sorry, or they don't say sorry, they don't apologize. Uh, I thought that was pretty interesting. And obviously, Not in the sense like, oh, they've, run someone over with their car and they're like, no, I'm not sorry. It wasn't like that. But you had mentioned that, men don't apologize. And so the women were taking that on too, and how that was a benefit.
Completely. What I found through this process is that language is so important. So, for instance, a few of the women I interviewed said to me, you know what, Susan, uh, when I need to interrupt somebody, I say, pardon me. I do not say I'm sorry. Unless I step on someone's toe and physically hurt them, then I'll say I'm sorry. But other than that, I am not sorry. Should I be sorry for just existing?
Mm.
Should I be sorry as a woman who wants to say something? I'm not, I took that out of my vocabulary. And it's something that actually I share with my colleagues quite a bit, especially the women colleagues I have, to not say sorry and to not start a sentence with, sorry, excuse me.
Hmm.
It's not worth it. And if you notice, when you are in a team meeting or if you work in an office, and the men never start their sentences or their interruptions with, I'm sorry, it just puts you at this defensive.
Hmm.
Uh, in addition to that, something I've learned along this process is instead of using sorry, using gratitude. So even if you're late for a meeting, you can say, thank you for your patience.
Hmm.
And you're starting out of a place of gratitude. And many of the women I interviewed, you really use gratitude instead of being apologetic. And I think that's far more important to be in a place of gratitude.
The idea of saying sorry is interesting because I think that's ingrained.
Mm,
I'm going to have to say in all women just because I am one and I see it, I can look back over the course of time as far as like, mom, grandma, aunties, going on and on. And, honestly, even with my daughters, I recognize, they do that too. So it is something we work on, but it is interesting that when you consciously start to change the language in those types of situations, it's like there's a shift that
right.
was not there before, and it is interesting to just to see the empowerment that brings to a woman who recognizes that when she's in these types of positions as well.
And we need to tell each other that.
Mm,
So if you hear other women who are apologizing for no reason, tell them not to. Say, what are you sorry about?
mm,
Use something else and stop them. Stop them from saying it because it really is going to take all of us working together to change this language,
mm.
which will make us stronger as a gender. And also, we can actually say what we really mean because when we say we're sorry, it doesn't necessarily represent what we actually mean. We're not actually sorry.
Well, it's almost like an automatic response, and maybe has necessarily not doesn't have anything necessarily to do with the what's coming
Right.
afterwards. It's just automatic. I'm sorry, but I'm sorry, and I'm sorry. Yes, it happens all the time. But when you start to consciously pay attention and consider what you're saying prior to it, and exchange those words out, like you said, for gratitude, which is excellent. I think it like I said, shifts everything within a room.
And that's what diplomats do with language, though. They have to choose their words very carefully because they're representing their countries. They don't want to start an international conflict. So they choose their words very carefully. They speak a little bit slower. And it's something all of us can use to think and choose our words carefully to actually say what we mean.
Mm.
And both men and women will be stronger communicators in saying what they really mean if they take the time to think and then say it.
It's funny because we say that to our kids when they're little.
Right.
Think
But
what?
we forget.
Yeah, so yeah. I don't know what happened, but we all of a sudden we don't do it anymore. But we expect our 5-year-old child to do it or whatever. It's interesting that we do that as we get older. All of this being said, I'm so thankful that you came on today. My podcast is really about breaking traditions and norms and empowering, especially women, but empowering anyone who is, looked upon as less than or a minority, or their gender is not recognized. What do you feel in the process of writing this book has enabled you to become empowered and then share that empowerment with others and change a tradition or a norm?
Hearing these stories from these women and looking at the research that supports many of the things that they said, it made me look at diversity in a different light. that we really do create better solutions for all problems when we have diversity of thought.
Mm.
And to have diversity of thought, you have to have diversity of people. When we look at the United States, we come from a very diverse nation. And we have all these different ethnicities living here, sexual orientation, socioeconomic status. We are really a diverse country, far more than a homogeneous country that really has very few different people. So, because we have so much diversity in the United States, we need to use different ways of thinking to solve problems. And that's what I realized through this process is that when we look at diversity, it shouldn't just be diversity for diversity's sake to say, hey, we got X, Y, or Z person. We have an African American, we have an Asian, no, it shouldn't be thought of about that. There shouldn't be a quota. And that's something that I learned in
Mm.
this process, especially from the ambassador from Australia, is that quotas don't work. When you have a quota of diversity, that doesn't really work. Now, targets, they work. They're aspirational. You can say, hey, we want to get 40% men and 40% women and 20% either or. And that works, saying if we get qualified people coming through our door applying for these positions, but quota just for diversity's sake doesn't work.
Mm.
And so when I look at how we build teams and how I'm going to use this in my own career, and I hope other people use in their career, is saying, okay, let's not just do diversity for diversity's sake, but it's really for thoughtful leadership coming from a diverse lens of thinking. Because the thinking, that's where we need the diversity. It can't just be because this person is, this color, that doesn't work. It has to be diversity of thought. And then when you bring people together that come from different walks of life, they think differently. They've had different situations that have built them to be who they are. And they're sharing that background and how they make decisions. And that's pretty powerful. As people, especially in the United States, we need this diversity of thought. And it shouldn't just be a quota.
Mm. So, how do we get the ball rolling on thought? I wasn't going to keep asking you questions, but when you said diversity of thought, that kind of blew my mind. Not to be, I'm not trying to make a pun. It's just that that's literally what it is our mindset. I talk about all the time. No, it's one thing to physically do these things, but there has to be a change of thought. There has to be a change of mind. And which, gosh, delves even further into like soul. You cannot change these things if it isn't felt within at a deeper level. And so where do we start? What can we do then?
Well, it's interesting you asked this because in this process of writing the book, the different women I interviewed, they shared this universal idea that many of them held very true to themselves and true to their souls, is that just because they had an idea as a leader doesn't make other people's ideas wrong.
Mm.
So, in order for someone to be right, you don't have to make another person wrong. And there's this idea that actually my own team plays with. It's kind of an improv idea. When we sit around a table and we're discussing an idea and brainstorming, instead of saying, if someone says, let's say Todd says, hey, I have this idea for this event, instead of saying, Todd, no, but that's not going to work. We should really do this. Instead of saying no, but we use yes, and Todd, let's build on that and do this.
Mm.
And so it already changes this positive mindset. So it takes you away from negativity of saying no, but, and yes, and helps you build on someone's idea. And so when you're brainstorming, when you're thinking about anything, it can be yes and, right?
Mm.
And many of these women employ these ideas that I interviewed that when they work with their teams, they are taking the yes and approach of saying, hey, yeah, let's get all these ideas on the table and let's talk about them together and then find a solution together that fits. And even if you're thinking like, wow, I'm a mom and I'm not working in a team full time, but actually you are working with a family. Your team is your family. And when you guys are discussing what to do for the weekend or how to organize a grocery trip or whatever it is, or family vacation, are you using yes and or
Mm.
using no but? And that can change the mindset almost of just positivity, which I think is inherent when I look at any idea that you want to create or to help you flourish, if it comes from a place of positivity, it's far more rewarding and you're more likely to do it, right?
Well, I think you'd even have the encouragement of another, because I know if you get an idea shot down, no matter, big or small. I'm thinking about it now while you're saying this, and I'm thinking about if one of my kids asked me to do something or whatever, and we're talking about things on a much bigger scale, obviously, but the idea of saying no, it's an almost an immediate shutdown, and you might not hear anything more from someone who's, you're when you are having big meeting type talks, and so
Right.
the switching that mindset then on not just yourself but everybody in the room is, I can see the benefit of doing it that
Definitely.
way. Yeah.
Now, some ideas, now you don't want to go murder somebody. I mean, not
Right.
all ideas
Yes,
need
and
to,
yeah.
right? Not all ideas need to be yes and.
Right.
It's not saying like, if Todd's got an awful idea, it's like, Todd, no, we're not going to kill and create a cult. Like, we're not
Yeah,
doing that.
right.
Um, so it's not saying every idea is going to work, right? But it's that general mindset of positivity, of not shutting it down. And even when I think back a few years ago, I knew I wanted to write a book, and I had a call with a literary agent, and they told me, no, you do not have pillars for publishing. You don't have an interesting idea. No one's
Mm.
going to read your book. You don't have a following. You're not famous. You're not a celebrity. And I listened to that no for a few years. I was like, well, that person was right. I'm not going to do this. But then the idea of writing a book just kept coming up for me again and again and again. And finally, I told myself, yes, you know what? I'm not going to listen to that no anymore. And so I think with each of us, when we have an idea, usually the first hurdle is saying yes to
Mm.
ourselves and believing in it and going with it. And then the other no's, letting them drift away. And Ambassador Bodine even said that. She heard no all the time growing up. She came from a very dysfunctional home. And I write about her story in the book. And she said, when you hear no all the time, you eventually you just try to figure out how to make it a yes.
Mm.
And as women, we constantly hear no, maybe to positions of leadership, to opportunities, and we need to start making it a yes
Mm.
and turning that around. And the first thing we need to do is say yes to ourselves.
Wow. Yeah. That's good. I agree. So, where can we find this book and you, and how can my listeners connect with you
Well,
outside of the
first, I
podcast?
would say, yes, please connect with me
Mm.
at susansloan.com, SUSANSLOAN.com. And the book is on sale on Amazon, Kindle, Barnes and Noble, Kobo. So you can find me online. I know most of us are home at coronavirus time. So you can order the book online. And hopefully, after all this lockdown is over, I hope to do a speaking tour where I go around the country. So maybe you'll see me around the country, but check out the book. I'd love to hear people's thoughts on it. And you can connect with me on my website, susansloan.com. You can write me a note and I'll be happy to correspond with you as well.
Well, that's great. Thank you so much. I actually got the book, everybody, so you can go get it, and it is fabulous. I haven't finished it yet, but I'll tell you what, I'm sucked in already. Thank you so much, Susan, for coming on and chatting with me today. I appreciate you.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much for listening to today's episode of That's Not Proper. If you are interested in connecting with Susan, please check out her website at susansloan.com and grab her book. I got mine off of Amazon, A Seat at the Table, Women, Diplomacy, and Life Lessons for the World. Make sure you listen in next week to That's Not Proper, where I will be speaking with Alicia Galati. She is one of the hosts of Two Sisters and a Cult, and we're going to be hearing her story and her journey surviving a cult. Remember